Oh, as long as the check. Yeah, cool. For their purposes, that are for all.
All right, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this chilly gray afternoon, but at least we have windows to look out. My name is Celeste Arrington. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIKS. I'm also the co-director of the East Asia National Resources Center, and I'm part of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. Those three institutions, in addition to the Taiwan Education and Research Program, here at GW, are very pleased to co-host today's event. And as you can tell, this is not just a Korea policy forum, but we're looking at Korea in the broader Indo-Pacific context today. When we originally began planning this event, we did not anticipate that we might have new governments in all three of the Japan, Korea, and United States capitals. But it's, I think, timely that as we start to welcome a Trump 2.0 administration next week here in Washington and watch Korean political drama unfold and look forward to what happens in Japan, we consider more broadly the region. One thing besides our local co-hosts, I would like to say we are co-hosting today's event, GWIKS here at GW, alongside this Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University and Ritsumeikan University in Japan have all joined forces. So this is really a large collaboration among many different institutions. And today's event would not have been possible without the hard work of the staff and the faculty from all of these different institutions. And so from my vantage point at GWIKS and the NRC, I want to thank you for all of your hard work in putting today's event together. We have two panels. The first panel is going to look at grand strategy, and the second panel will take a look at some emerging issues. And I know you want to hear probably less from me and more from our panelists. So let me just say that as we look at the opportunities and challenges ahead for the US policy and the Indo-Pacific, I think this is a really critical juncture, to use a political science term, in which there are many different ways forward. And considering the diverse perspectives that we have on this important region and the United States role in interacting with this region today. I think you'll see from our panelists that we bring great insights and many different perspectives on the way forward. So without further ado, I am going to start off the first panel, which I am moderating, but please join me in thanking all of our co-hosts. So our first panel today, is this microphone working? Good. Okay. Our first panel today includes 4 different experts from different parts of the region. And I'm going to introduce them each right before they speak. So my colleague, Professor Bob Sutter, is going to be our first speaker today. He is a professor of practice here at the Elliott School at GW. He had a long career in government previously and has served in a variety of different capacities. And he has also conducted recent research about U.S.-China tensions in the region. And I think that'll inform his presentation today. As a fellow GW faculty, I really am appreciative of his expertise and welcome him today. So Bob, why don't you start us off?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with you and to share some ideas as we engage in a dialogue on and to look at the situation. The topic I have is the new U.S. administrations and relations with the Indo-Pacific region. I'm supposed to have a focus on China to some degree, but I'm just going to look at this from the U.S. perspective in competing with China in Asia. And so therefore, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to look at the regional context for the new administration. What do they face in the region? And then I'm going to look at 3 areas of likely Trump administration action and see how that fits within the broader context of the U.S.-China competition, and particularly U.S. efforts to strengthen their position in influence in the region. The regional context. Keep in mind, this would be challenging for any U.S. president to deal with. The situation in Asia is one of, when our surveys and other surveys that took place in the last year, there's a great deal of dissatisfaction with the United States. The people that we interviewed in various countries didn't particularly like Harris, and they didn't like Trump for the most part. So this is a tough job, and we shouldn't expect too much. There were no positives in these surveys. There was nothing positive about the election. It was all negatives. How do we deal with this problem? How do we deal with that problem? And the Trump was seen as more troublesome than Harris because he's prone to unpredictable and abrupt decision-making. He's more economically protectionist. He's less attentive to allies and partners. So for all those reasons, he was more troublesome. But Harris wasn't, people weren't enthusiastic about Harris either. And all these individuals in different states in the Indo-Pacific, they have a whole host of worries in addition to coping with the United States and coping with Mr. Trump. For example, economic protectionism in developed countries is really growing. And this is a big problem for export-oriented economies like you see in the Indo-Pacific. And there's a perception that this economic disengagement in these kinds of ways by the United States is emblematic of perhaps the U.S. isn't really that interested in Asia anymore. And that underlying question comes into play. And then there are these conflicting pressures that come from the U.S.-China rivalry, which these states have to deal with. And it seems that Mr. Trump, that the Trump administration is very committed to hardening U.S. policy toward China in a variety of ways. And yet Mr. Trump himself is transactional. And so there's doubt as to where exactly he's going to come down on these issues. And then we have other problems. Several of these important countries in the Indo-Pacific, in Taiwan, the Philippines, and South Korea, all have big political divisions. and they could shift and we're going to probably see something like this in South Korea in the coming year. And then you have these protracted unresolved crises that they have to worry about. North Korea and Myanmar are two big crises. And then the Russians attacked Ukraine and broke all the rules in doing that and made many countries look at China as probably going to attack Taiwan. And the result was countries like Japan and Australia and South Korea looked at the situation in Taiwan in a very different way and aligned more with the United States and with NATO in dealing with these kinds of situations. And then the war in the Middle East led to a perception that the U.S. was basically overstretched. They just couldn't, how can they do all these things? Well, I guess they can't. And there was a sense of that as well. So these kinds of, how does a U.S. leader overcome these kinds of things? I think it's a tall order. It's a very tall order. I'm very sympathetic with any U.S. president in this situation. So what are the three specific things that the Trump administration will I think, do? I think these are, I think, logical to argue. Tariffs. He's going to do a lot more tariffs, and that's very clear. And this is disruptive in the region. Most of the people in the region aren't going to like this very much at all. It complicates things for the government. Now, there are upsides to this for some countries. If U.S. companies are disengaging from China because of the tariffs, they may be more inclined to invest in other countries in the region to bypass the tariffs. And so that certainly could happen. And keep in mind, and I think this is quite important for us to think about, the domestic concerns of the Trump administration, I think, will be very high. They have a lot to do domestically. And tax cuts are number one. And they're going to want those tax cuts. And those tax cuts will have the benefit of putting our economy on a sugar high. We're going to have a boom here for about a year at least. And so that could lead to a lot of exports from Asia, whether you have market access, special market access to the U.S. or not. And so this could offset the tariffs to some degree, is something to think about. And then, okay, so then the second area is, of course, less positive attention, less close consultation with allies and partners, more demands on key allies and partners regarding trade balances, military preparedness, and burden sharing. That's what happened in the first term. I think that's going to happen in this term as well. One thing I think about is that maybe this won't get so much attention as it did in the past. There's a lot of other things that Mr. Trump has to think about. He may not get involved in this. But the regional implications of this are to alienate allies and partners and reinforce the fact that U.S. is now economically protectionist, and leads to a situation where the disenchantment with the United States and a sense that the U.S. is not as committed to Asia as it once was. And believe me, the Chinese specialists that look at this issue say this is a very good thing. This is going to make it much easier for China to rise in Asia unfettered by an engaged America. And then you have the third area where Trump's senior appointments are all people, the vast majority are people who are very tough on China. They are going to be continuing this hardening policy to defend. It's a very important to understand it from the Washington perspective. The United States is trying to protect itself. It sees itself under threat from China strategically, economically, and in governance. And is trying to, and they see all these challenges coming from China, and they're trying to counter them in various ways. So that exercise, I think, will continue with the Trump people. But then you have Mr. Trump. President Trump is transactional, and he's quite capable of he likes to make deals, and he's quite capable of making deals. And he's the only politician within 100 miles of here that says nice things about Xi Jinping. He's the only one. There isn't anyone else that does that. And so, but he does. And so what does he want? And so this is something he is seen as wanting a deal. And so this kind of deal is seen, there could be two types of deal. There could be many types, but I see two types. One is the trade deal, like he did in the first term. That would be not disruptive too much. But the other would be a grand bargain which would involve Taiwan and other issues like that, which could be extremely destabilizing for Taiwan, but also for Japan and perhaps South Korea and others with a concern with the security situation in the region. And so the implications of this, I think, are quite serious. On the trade side, I think you can have a deal without it too serious. On the other side, I think that's very serious. And it's not only serious for countries in Asia, it's serious for bipartisan majorities in Congress. If you follow the congressional majorities, you'll see for 6 years, they have been vigilant in looking at these kinds of issues. China is a danger. They're the ones that keep at this. We've got to counter these challenges coming from China. And Xi Jinping is totally untrustworthy in this situation. And so if Mr. Trump tried this type of thing, you say, well, he controls the Republican Party, he'll do what he says. On this one, I don't think so. On this one, I think he'll meet resistance. I think he'll lose. And he doesn't like to lose. And so my point is, I don't think he'll do it, is my basic point. Okay, so my concluding observation is that President Trump's first term followed an erratic path in developing and executing competition with China in the Indo-Pacific and gave low priority in dealing with the regional concerns listed above. The overall result was decline in U.S. regional influence, with China emerging as the regional leader in economic, political, and security matters. The Biden administration was more consistent in competing with China and more attentive to regional concerns, and U.S. influence in the region grew relative to China. The above noted things that I've just talked about suggest that Asian leaders and the future of the Trump policy suggests that decline in U.S. regional influence will resume amid a complicated mix of factors negatively impacting regional prosperity and stability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that presentation. I think you started us off well, if maybe not on the most optimistic of notes, but that is our challenge for today. We're going to turn to our second speaker today. Dr. Youngju Jang is a visiting research fellow at the Center for East Asia Peace and Cooperation Studies at Ritsumeikan University in Japan, where she got her PhD from Ritsumeikan University as well as her MA. And some of her specialties include Japan, DPRK, or North Korea relations, which will be the topic, or Japanese foreign policy will be the topic of her presentation today, as well as Japan's policy towards North Korea.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Arrington and Professor Yuno Kim for having me here today as one of the panelists. It's my honor to make remark in this important event. Is my voice good enough, big enough? Okay. Sure. So let me begin by quickly going back to Kishida's legacy in the security policy. So Kishida government kind of renewed the national security strategy in December 2022, which aims at promoting security policy aligned with universal values, including democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. The symbolic approach, there are some symbolic approach, and one of them is to conduct diplomacy, reinforcing the free and open international order, together with the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And in other words, Japan opposes to challenge to the status quo by force. The clear target is China, and North Korea and Russia follow as one of the top three security threats. Another thing is bolstering defense capability, and it has two pillars. One is owning counter-attack measures capabilities, and the second thing is budget increase, defense budget increase from 1% of GDP to 2%, which roughly amounting. So this one has 5-year project, and in total, the increase, the amount will be 27.5 billion US dollars for 5 years. So simply doubled. And another milestone from the Kishida government is reinforcing Japan, US, South Korea trilateral cooperation. And for example, summit at Camp David in August 2023. And after that, joint air combat drill in October followed, and joint military drill in June 2024. So now, what is Prime Minister Ishiba's vision for security policy? It is considered that he inherits a major and a large part of Kishida's security policy. But what I think is remarkable is that he tries to take stronger initiatives in security policy. For example, he states that a need of establishing the Asian NATO. By metaphoring Ukraine-Russia war to a possible Taiwan-China conflict, he argues that a war over Taiwan-China is more likely to occur since there is no collective defense framework in East Asia, like NATO in Europe. So that's one thing he points out. And another thing he mentioned was upgrading US-Japan asymmetric alliance as strong and equal as the US-UK alliance. And it's like basically transforming the existing alliance to an equal one as the one between like normal states and perform joint defense in the Indo-Pacific region. That's the vision he personally has. Simultaneously, however, improving the relations with China is also included as a priority. And lastly, Ishiba's government tried to bolster diplomatic cooperation with South Korea, including the security division, considering the current security landscape. This year, Japan and South Korea is going to have the 60th anniversary of diplomatic normalization. So this is in a way right timing to the government to reinforce the alliance. And let me quickly talk about Prime Minister Ishiba's North Korea policy. As probably all of you know, Japan has issue with North Korea about abduction, and it's obviously not resolved yet. And in this North Korea policy, the Ishiba's government will remain the same stance as his predecessors, which is continuing to request resuming adequate and thorough investigation, including those who are potentially kidnapped to the North Korea, assuming all the victims are all alive. But so this is exactly the same as his predecessors has stated. But so far, no positive move have occurred. Even after the Stockholm Agreement signed in 2014, it's been already a decade, but still no progress between the two countries. But one thing I would like to highlight here is that his comments about building a liaison office in Pyongyang, that was one of his goal when if he was selected as the leader of LDP, but now he was elected and now he's a prime minister. So this statement is worth to remember, I think. But the dilemma Japan has had is the security issue, like nuclear missile issue, is more critical in the region and the Japan, US, South Korea trilateral cooperation. And because of this structure, Japan is not able to promote talks with concession beyond the US and South Korea's acceptable range. So that means it needs to take a difficult balance. As my concluding remark, let me mention about the reality. Considering all these things that I have mentioned, The reality and obstacles under the coalition government is that, so the Kishiba's LDP, under this coalition government, so Ishiba's LDP marked a significant loss in the most recent House of Representative election in October 2024. And so having said that, unlike domestic issues, about external issues like including security issue, my view is that although Prime Minister Ishiba faces challenging circumstances under this coalition government, conduct of security policy is likely to remain relatively stable as Kishida's administration. And the obstacles or the uncertainty rather lie on the external factors, including and particularly the Trump administration's foreign policy and South Korea's martial law crisis and the directions of China's foreign policy. So how to take the balance among these critical factors is the key for a successful management of the Japan's security policy. Let me end here my remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. We'll turn back now to a U.S. perspective. It's my great pleasure to welcome back a GW alum and former student of mine, Drew Arvisith. He has been the director for the Korean Peninsula and Mongolia at the U.S. National Security Council for the last 2+ years. Previously had also served in the intelligence community. And as I mentioned, the highlight of his bio is that he is a graduate of GW. For all of you MA students out there, this is what you could pursue. But in addition, I would like to say that he is going to not necessarily address what the next administration is going to do, but rather what challenges or questions the next administration will face.
It really is an honor to be back here at GW on this side of the table. Last time I was in this room, I was in the audience watching a panel very similar to this one. As a civil servant in the U.S. government, my intention today is to provide you with an understanding of, as Professor said, some of the opportunities and challenges that face the U.S. government as we consider our policy direction. We're a number of changes during the past 4 years that we have Russia, for example, and important to close on a positive note. Let me first start with some of the challenges that we're seeing, and then I can turn to some of the positive actions that we're able to take from the Biden administration, as well as in terms of challenge. First and foremost, also this is a conversation that we also need to have. Second, North Korea's growing relationship. Ukrainian forces. Um, and we have now seen casualties upwards of 1,000 North Korean troops in Russia. Uh, this is unprecedented in terms of North Korea's policy direction previously. And the open question remains, what does North Korea receive in return for providing not only troops, but ballistic missiles and munitions to Russia's war effort? Not only are they getting a huge amount of technical experience as a result of watching how their systems perform in active combat between Russia and Ukraine, they're also gaining valuable battlefield insight, looking at the ways in which Ukrainian forces are trying to engage in combat against Russia. Those are things that North Korea will be able to take back and use directly in the event that a conflict were to break out on the Korean Peninsula. Has very real consequences for obviously South Korea, but also for the United States and our forces that are stationed there. In addition to some of these very real military concerns, we also have a situation where Russia is able to shield North Korea on the global stage from various sorts of multilateral initiatives, such as the enforcement of UN Security Council resolutions. We saw the disbandment of a UN panel of experts this last year that was tasked with monitoring the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions. And that just degrades our ability as an international community to monitor and evaluate the efficacy of various sanctions efforts on North Korea. So a lot that we have to consider with regard to this burgeoning relationship, not to mention, of course, what this means for China relative to North Korea and any influence that China may or may not have with Pyongyang. Third thing that I'd like to discuss is North Korea's revenue generation capabilities. At this point, North Korea has a number of very proficient actors who are able to generate revenue through cyber-enabled means, cryptocurrency money laundering, the use of IT workers that in many instances have gained employment at legitimate businesses, but then who are able to send any revenue that they make back to North Korea, or they're able to use access to company resources to then steal those resources and divert them to North Korea. Hugely problematic for us for a number of reasons, but foremost would be the revenue goes directly to North Korea's WMD program, which is the final item that I'd like to address today. North Korea has continued to make advancements. We saw an SRBM launch earlier this week of a couple missiles into the waters between Korea and Japan. And this is just one of many actions North Korea has taken in order to continue advancing its weapons program. Fortunately, despite all of these developments, we have taken, as the United States, a number of actions to try and prepare ourselves against these sorts of military developments that North Korea is making. One of the key actions we have taken in the past few years is by increasing our extended deterrence commitments to our regional allies, particularly South Korea and Japan. We had the Washington Declaration that we announced back in 2023, and the subsequent Nuclear Consultative Group, which has really revolutionized the way in which the United States engages in planning and conversations related to potential nuclear contingencies related to North Korea. We have also substantially increased our trilateral cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States, beginning with, of course, the Camp David Summit that has been mentioned, but we have continued the work there, increasing the real-time data sharing related to the North Korea missile threat between our three countries, and also just a few months ago established a trilateral secretariat that we will use to ensure that we maintain at the working level as well as the senior official level close connections between our three capitals to ensure that any developments not only related to North Korea but related to the broader security environment in the Indo-Pacific are addressed, and we have alignment between our various policies toward the region. We've also looked very closely at the way in which we enforce sanctions, including in the establishment of a multilateral sanctions monitoring team that is helping us assess ways in which countries across the world are implementing those UN Security Council resolutions. That team will be able to provide reporting to the Security Council and to others in the international community as they work to prevent funds going to North Korea's illicit WMD program. That's just some of the work that we have been doing that is helping us set the stage for our continued ability to address North Korea-related threats, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but globally. Concerted efforts will continue to be made, not only by the U.S., but by our allies in the region, and we look forward to continuing the charge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew. I will save my question, but I did forget to mention in introducing Drew that he was a core architect of the Camp David and Trilateral Summitry institutionalization that happened under the Biden administration. So we'll come back to that in my question for you. But last but not least, let me introduce Professor Kim Bom-soo, who is the head of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. This institute has been a longtime partner of GWIKS, and I'm really grateful for that partnership. We have run a number of different events, and we also publish a US ROK policy brief since late last year, which you might want to check out on the GWIKS or Seoul National University website. So Professor Kim Bom-soo is in the Department of International Relations at Seoul National University, a political scientist. He earned his PhD from University of Chicago, and has most recently also served as the dean for the College of Liberal Studies at Seoul National University. He has wide-ranging research interests, but the topic for his presentation today will focus on South Korea's foreign policy. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you for introducing me. Yes, as Professor Sellington mentioned, I'm serving as a director for the Institute for Peace and Unification Study at Seoul National University. But my main expert area is a political thought or the political theory. So my comments on foreign policy, Korea's foreign policy is superficial to some extent. Anyway, today I was asked to have a presentation on Korea's foreign policy and the US-ROK alliance. For now, regarding this issue, maybe as many of you already know, I can say nothing is certain. So everything is uncertain under this situation. As many of you already know, in Korea, there was a martial law crisis, and in US, the Trump administration will start next week. So there are two uncertainty, both sides. So it is very, very difficult topics. But today I briefly mentioned President Yoon administration's foreign and security policy, and then I will examine briefly Trump administration key policy direction. And finally, on the basis of these, under the uncertain situation, I will examine some issues will happen in this year. And I think my presentation is have many overlap with the through RSS presentation. So I appreciate your understanding. First, let me say the President Yoon's foreign and security policy. As many of you already know, President Yoon, who was inaugurated as a president in two and a half years ago, and his slogan, one of his slogan was peace through strength. So he criticized previous Moon's administration's policy toward North Korea. He said that only peace only can get through strength. Under this slogan, he emphasized ROK U.S. alliance. So one of his main policy is extended deterrence through the ROK U.S. alliance. On this way, as Drew Evers mentioned, yes. So the 2026, the Washington Declaration was adopted at the U.S. ROK Summit on April 26 on 2023. So in this Washington Declaration, both countries agreed to establish a nuclear consultative group and agreed to hold quarterly meetings. And they also agreed to have an expansion of regular deployment of U.S. strategic assets, including nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines to the Korean Peninsula. And on this way, again, on August, as already mentioned by the Drew Evers said, the ROK US-Japan summit was held in Camp David, and they adopt spirit of Camp David. In this announcement, three president and leaders agreed. They said, we will strengthen strategic coordination between the ROK US and US-Japan alliance and elevate trilateral security cooperation to a new level. And they also mentioned that ROK US-Japan cooperation is for the entire Indo-Pacific regions. And additionally, as many of you already know, President Yoon's policy toward North Korea emphasized freedom and human rights. So the previous, the progressive Moon's administration emphasized the kind of sunshine policy, which means to have some dialogue with North Korea. But unlikely, in contrast, Yoon's policy toward North Korea emphasized freedom and human rights and try to oppress or try to suppress the North Korea. So in this line, last year, President Yoon Suk-yeol emphasized in his Independence Movement Day speech, saying that he said that the March 1st movement is fully realized only through reunification, where everyone enjoys freedom and prosperity, and state that expanding universal values such as freedom and human rights is the essence of reunification. So this speech was regarded as an announce of the kind of aggressive policy toward North Korea. At the same time, the President Yoon also mentioned that expanding the last year, August 15 doctrine, he also announced the August 15 doctrine. In this doctrine, he said, emphasized the value of freedom and human right again. And yes, so the free democratic unified state on the entire Korean peninsula is achieving conflict liberation. He emphasized this one. Anyway, the Yoon's policy will face the challenge if after the many experts thought that the Yoon's policy will have a challenge after the launch of the Trump administration. But for now, as you know, after the martial law crisis, all Yoon's policy was stopped, and we do not know what would happen in this year. Anyways, so the Trump administration key policy toward the Korean Peninsula, actually, the Drew Eversey mentioned many things, but as you know, on security side, Trump administration emphasized America first foreign and security policy, and treating alliance as a deal and neglecting alliance. So last year, maybe many of you already know the Trump during the presidential election campaign, Donald Trump mentioned that renegotiation of the cost sharing for U.S. force in Korea is necessary. So these days, South Korea pay $1 billion US dollar annually for the cost of stationing U.S. troops. But last year, October 15, in the Chicago Economic Club interview, Donald Trump said that South Korea should pay $10 billion annually for the cost of stationing U.S. troops. So 10 times more. So many Korean experts thought that after the launch of the Trump administration, maybe President Donald Trump would ask the increase of the cost for stationing U.S. troops in South Korea. And there is another possibility of improving North and U.S. relations through summit diplomacy. As many of you already remember, in 2018, Donald Trump met the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Singapore and in Hanoi, and have many summit diplomacy. So it is expected that after the launch of the Trump administration, there is a possibility of lifting sanctions and improving North-U.S. relations in exchange for nuclear freezing and non-proliferation. And on economic trade side, as you know, the Trump emphasized a protectionist trade policy. So he mentioned that he will impose 60% tariff on Chinese product and 10 to 20% universal tariff on all goods, including those from Korea. So it is expected that there might be some possibility of revising the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement in the soon. Anyway, under these uncertain situation, maybe I might have some prospect on Korean Peninsula in this year. As I mentioned already, there are political uncertainty and instability is increasing in South Korea these days. So after the failure of the martial law attempt, you may so in the news yesterday, President Yoon Suk-yeol was arrested yesterday, and now waiting for the arrest warrant. So if the arrest warrant was issued, then maybe he might be in prison, and he will be he should wait for the Constitutional Court decision. After the Constitutional Court approved his impeachment, then he will be impeached finally, and there might be the presidential election this year. Probably, we thought that presidential election will be held. If the situation is going as usual, then maybe presidential election will be held in May or June this year. So we do not know exactly what would happen in the spring or summer in Korea. Anyway, one thing is certain. There is nothing certain for now. Anyway, yes, the increased uncertainty. There are many uncertainty in inter-Korean relations or in North Korea. As Drew Eversey already mentioned, the North Korea is involved in Russia-Ukraine war. But what would happen if the Russia-Ukraine war come to an end? We do not know exactly when the Ukraine-Russia war come to an end. But what will happen? What would happen to North Korean troops dispatched to Russia after the end of the Russia-Ukraine war? We should watch it. And as I mentioned, there might be some renegotiation of the U.S. troop cost sharing in South Korea, but we do not know exactly how much or to what extent should Korea pay. And Donald Trump mentioned many times, if there's no increase of the cost sharing, then there might be reduction of U.S. force in South Korea. So we do not know exactly what happened if the renegotiation of the U.S. troop cost sharing failed. And another possibility is the revival of the, as I mentioned, 2018 North Korea-U.S. summit. So as you know, the many policy experts say that not this year, maybe this year, Donald Trump administration focused on the Ukraine war, but next year, probably summer or just before the midterm election, there might be some possibility of the dialogue with North Korea. I'm not sure, but the many Korean experts say that Donald Trump's goal is to get the Nobel Peace Prize, having a negotiation with North Korea. So yeah, there's some possibility anyway. And finally, from North Korea side, as many of you know, North Korea will continue to have low-level provocation, maybe to have some to induce dialogue with the U.S. administration. So a couple of days ago, North Korea had a missile launch, and they will have some more missile launches. And but the likelihood of the nuclear test seems very low, I think. And anyway, there might be some ongoing tension and stalemate in inter-Korean relations. If President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment is confirmed, a presidential election may be held in the spring of 2025. And if the Progressive Party get the power, then there might be some change. There might be some change in inter-Korean relations, but we do not know yet. But the possibility of large-scale military conflict between the two Korea seems very low, I think. Anyway, as a conclusion, I think managing stability in inter-Korean relation is very, very crucial for under these uncertain circumstances. So we should watch what would happen in Korea and what would happen in the U.S. Thank you for my listening.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Before I open it up to questions from our audience, both in the room and online, I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the four of you about how institutionalized and long-lasting trilateral relations are. Dr. Jung mentioned the Camp David summits, and a core goal of that was to sort of create an insurance policy in U.S. ROK Japan cooperation so that it might outlast the individual leaders. At the time, I don't think we knew that we would be having major political changes in all three countries. So as Professor Kim just mentioned at the end, one thing's certain, nothing is certain. In South Korean politics, we may have a return to a progressive president, potentially Lee Jae-myung in South Korea this spring. Historically, progressives in South Korea have found it electorally beneficial to adopt an anti-Japan strategy. So how ensured or insulated is the trilateral cooperation from South Korean electoral machinations? In Japan, also, as Dr. Zhang mentioned, we may have elections and the coalition government is in a relatively weak position, but you predicted some stability in Japanese foreign policy. Historically, conservatives in Japan have also found it electorally beneficial to raise history issues. I guess I'll leave it at that, which has irritated Japan-Korea relations in the past. Bob Sutter also brought up the America First policy, and so did Professor Kim in the US, where it's electorally beneficial for the Trump administration to prioritize US interests. So again, how institutionalized or long-lasting is trilateral cooperation likely to be? Especially since the Trump administration previously did not have that much time for multilateral cooperation and coordination with allies, as you mentioned in your presentation, Bob. So my broader question is, what can you say about the longevity of trilateral cooperation? And then the second question, many of you raised the point that it may be external actors that are going to external actors' actions, not the US-Japan ROK actors who are going to be determining the future. Are there potentially divergent goals or interests among Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, say vis-a-vis China? And to what extent are those differences of opinion going to frustrate coordinated efforts to deal with the external actors' actions? So, Bob, do you want to start us off here?
This is really complicated, isn't it? Wow, this is on the trilateral relationship. My sense is that it's really going to be up to the polities of Japan and South Korea to figure that one out, and particularly South Korea. I'm not sure what to say about America First and this type of thing in that regard, because I'm not sure how relevant it is in this situation. The America First movement, I think we have to keep it in context. It's not necessarily, it is focused on the United States more. But it's not always isolationist, and it's particularly not isolationist when it comes to competing with China. I would say more America First advocates are very adamant about China and competing with China than they are about neglecting China. And so if China is seen as taking advantage of a situation with disunity among the three Northeast Asian countries, I mean, with United States, Japan, and South Korea, that would probably prompt them to be more supportive in one way or another. So putting that in context, I think, is important, because in Congress, most of the people that are America First are very concerned about building capacities to compete with China. And so they don't want to focus on Ukraine, they want to focus on China. So it's that kind of a situation. But external actors determining his future, I think it's really up to the people and the voters and the politicians in South Korea in particular to deal with this issue. I mean, they seem to have the initiative. Will they change? Will they weaken the situation? Will they try to exploit these differences of the past? That's certainly a big possibility, and it's up to them, it seems to me.
Thank you. Dr. John, do you want to comment?
Sure.
Japanese politics.
Thank you for raising this. These are, like Professor Sutter mentioned, is very complicated and hard to answer. About Japan, so Japanese government has always emphasized its foreign policy center is with US-Japan alliance. So this is always the center, as I said. And this trilateral cooperation is second importance, I would say, in terms of Japan's foreign policy. And like I already mentioned, I assume the security policy, the Japan's stance is will stay as is, but it's more for depending on what kind of request the Trump administration will suggest to Japan as soon as after the inauguration. Because what happened was, of course, all of you might know, but that was request of increase the expense for the US base, military base. So what Japanese government is concerned about is that request would come again. And some already argue the percentage would be increased. And so that's what Japan has tried to do, was to show some a compromise or the increase in purchasing more weapons from US and such, and spending, generating more expenses in terms of defense capability. So in that regard, Ishiba's government I would say it would prefer to avoid the spending more expenses for the defense, because it's already doing it since Kishida's government, and more expenditure would incur domestic oppositions. So not just like other like rival political parties, but from citizens. So that's challenges Ishiba's government might have. And another thing is the relations with South Korea, and what happened in the Moon Jae-in government. This bilateral relations kind of was often argued that it was the worst situation in the history of Japan-South Korea relations after the diplomatic normalization. So Japanese government is concerned the same situation or similar level of the downing happens again. So of course Japan wants to avoid that. So, and then if, for example, Lee Jae-myung was elected again as a president after President Yoon, the whole efforts that had been built over the past 2-3 years might get damaged to some extent. That's some concern Japanese government has. So it's so difficult to take initiative, maneuver the foreign policy of Japan. And yeah, maybe I should stop here. But then China, of course, Japan is concerned about Taiwan-China relations, and considering Abe's statement back in 2021, Taiwan's crisis is Japan's crisis. This statement still infringe the feeling of Chinese government. So, but of course, this is what already happened. So Ishiba will not deny this statement. So this situation still exists, and yeah, so it's hard to predict.
I very much appreciate the question, since it's certainly the one that I ask myself on a daily basis. I want to start by perhaps offering an alternative to the assertion that nothing is certain, and offer a slight adjustment that while much is in fact uncertain, of a few things we can be sure. And what I will say with regard to trilateral cooperation between the United States, South Korea, and Japan is that we took a very deliberate approach to not only the Camp David summit, but to every trilateral interaction since then, to really institutionalize cooperation, not only at the leader level between our three countries, but within each and every one of our ministries. I'll give you a few examples today, but there are many, many more that I can't mention for lack of time. First, we agreed that we have a commitment to consult between our three countries on any shared security challenge. And we have used that a number of times in the past couple years to discuss a number of sensitive issues, to include, of course, the North Korea-Russia situation, as well as North Korean provocations and missile tests, for example. We have done a trilateral defense ministerial between our respective chiefs of defense, which has been really a valuable forum whereby we have discussed the ways in which we will engage in combined trilateral exercises such that we can improve our shared security and our ability to respond to various scenarios in the Indo-Pacific region. That is something that has been long in the works, and we have buy-in from our respective defense ministries in all three countries, which is truly remarkable progress. We have an Indo-Pacific dialogue that the State Department in the United States joins, as well as the foreign ministries from Korea and Japan, where we discuss our broader engagement and footprint in the Indo-Pacific region, whether that be humanitarian assistance, whether that be various types of development projects, looking at our economic relationship between our three countries with the broader region. We run the gambit in those discussions. That's something, again, where there's full buy-in at all levels of the foreign ministry apparatus. We have trilateral cooperation on North Korean cyber efforts and the actions that our three countries need to take between ourselves in terms of combating North Korean ability to generate revenue, but also engaging countries across the globe to discuss the severity of the issue and help them gain the insights they need to combat North Korean cyber activities in their own countries. Again, something that never would have been possible a few years ago when considering this trilateral relationship. Similarly, we're doing things like that in the sanctions space, looking at ways in which we can align our own autonomous sanctions against North Korea to ensure that we have a consistent policy approach across the three countries. I'll stop there in terms of things that we have done in the past couple of years alone to advance this trilateral relationship. That is a lot to undo by any one of the incoming leaders of our three countries. And that's really the focus that we have had, is looking at ways to build institutions, to build engagement at so many different levels that we have a lattice work of cooperation between the three countries, where in order to get rid of that, or if there were pressures by the public in any one of the three countries, it would require peeling back each one of those pillars, which fortunately, I think for all of us would take a pretty substantial amount of work. So the baseline for trilateral cooperation has been moved up. While there may be ups and downs along the road moving forward, I don't think that we are in a place where we will go back to what we have seen in previous iterations of trilateral cooperation.
Thank you. Kim Bong-soo, do you want to add anything here?
Yes, regarding the trilateral cooperation, basically I agree with Drew Albertche. Said personally, I think even though the progressive presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung won the election, that after that, I think the trilateral cooperation will continue. Even though there might be some challenges in the U.S. Korea relation or in the between the U.S. Japan relation. There might be many challenges, but despite the challenges, trilateral cooperation is very, very important, even for the progressive blocs in South Korea. So personally, it's my personal opinion, but I'm sure and I hope, wish the trilateral cooperation will continue. So as Mr. Drew Evers mentioned many times, there are many institutionalized institution for trilateral cooperation. So yes, after the change of the regime, after regime change in South Korea in this year, I'm very sure the progressive bloc will try to maintain the trilateral cooperation. But levels of cooperation might be different. Levels of cooperation might be lower compared with the previous administration, but basically, trilateral cooperation will continue.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up now to questions. Thank you for your patience from the audience. We have an audience online as well, so if you could type your questions into the Q&A box online. Let me ask that you identify yourself when you ask your question and keep your question brief. And if you want to address it to any one of our 4 speakers, please specify that. Okay, so I'll start taking questions now in the back.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, my name is Mark. I am a journalist from United Daily News, based in Taiwan. So obviously my first question would be, how would Taiwan play into the grand strategy of Indo-Pacific? And how would this role translate into the upcoming administration when Trump had hinted that Taiwan need to pay up and increase military expense tremendously? Thank you.
Do you want to take this?
Yeah, so I tried to indicate, this is a possibility of a deal between Mr. Trump and Xi Jinping that would involve Taiwan. And I think this is not likely to happen if I had to make a prediction today. I don't think it's too extreme, unless it was something that I don't know how it could be workable in this sense. I mean, the whole idea of doing this sort of thing would have to show very clearly how Taiwan's security would be sustained. The bipartisan majorities in Congress are very clear about this. And this has been clear for 6 years. And so if this were to jeopardize Taiwan's security, I think that would be a very serious problem for any president in the United States. And so on this one, therefore, I don't think this is going to happen on that basis. So I guess I'm making a risky prediction since Mr. Trump is very unpredictable. But this one, I think, is too difficult to do at this point. Maybe later on, but at this point, I just don't. I can understand because the consequences are very large, and I think that would be the priority of supporting Taiwan. It has never been higher since the 50s. The U.S. support for Taiwan is in Congress and so forth is just extraordinary, and so if that were in jeopardy in some way, I think you'd get a lot of pushback.
Thank you. Dr. Zhang, did you want to add anything from the Japanese perspective on Taiwan, or should we go to another question? You already mentioned that the Kishida's comment that a Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency. Okay, next question, please. In the back. Yes.
Hello, my name is Ju Young Ho, working as a correspondent to Washington, D.C. from Seoul. based in Seoul, Korea. And I understand this event is off the record, so I'd like to ask Mr. Arbasas. Yeah. So basically, the NCG is fundamentally a cooperation framework between South Korea and the United States. However, policymakers seem to have left room for the possibility of Japan's participation in the future in NCG. So after this political turmoil in South Korea, with the potential for a change in administration in South Korea and political changes into other countries, it might be challenging for South Korea and Japan to be part of the nuclear consultation group together with its historical animosities. So do you think that is trilateral cooperation the ultimate goal, even in nuclear collaboration?
Thank you for the question. I would say on NCG, it remains a bilateral group for the United States and Korea to discuss various potential nuclear contingencies. With Japan, the United States has a number of separate bilateral dialogues whereby we can discuss all manner of potential threats, including the extended deterrence dialogue between the U.S. and Japan. These remain very important, distinct bilateral groupings that I anticipate will continue, and that is very much our goal and objective, is to ensure that we maintain those robust groupings. Now, that being said, is there need for trilateral defense cooperation, for trilateral discussions on all manner of potential contingencies to include nuclear use in the region? Absolutely. And will we pursue those kinds of discussions with our allies in the region? Yes, we certainly will.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to a question from online, and I guess if I could ask for U.S., South Korean, and Japanese perspectives on this question. What are the prospects for cooperation with ASEAN area countries? Anybody want to take this question on? Potential opportunities? While I'm letting you think, let me take one more question from the floor. Do you want to say something first or take another question? Okay, why don't you?
Just on this one, one of the weaknesses of the Trump administration, the first term on ASEAN is concerned, is that he didn't go there. He didn't pay any attention to them. And I'm not sure that'll change in this administration. I think he'll probably not show up at the East Asian Forum and this type of thing. And so ASEAN will be unhappy. They'll be seen as secondary. And I wonder, I'm just speculating here, but I think, tell me this is a question really for the group, I think. How important is East Asia for Donald Trump now? I mean, when I look at the world, I say, God, he's got Ukraine, he's got the Middle East. Is he really going to pay much attention to East Asia? And so, and plus he's got all these, keep in mind that in the election, foreign policy was number 10 out of 10 issues being discussed. So it's not that big a deal politically. And so my sense is that he's not going to be that involved in these areas. And from the point of view of Japan, I think that's probably a good thing, because then they can finesse these issues and burden sharing and things like that. And I think the apparatus that Drew has been talking about is that we will continue to cooperate at that level. Under the secretary and undersecretary and levels like that will go forward. So I'm just speculating here, but ASEAN, I think, will not get the attention at the senior leaders, and they won't like that, and they'll be concerned about it. But the other countries, it might be a blessing. In other words, he's not going to be paying much attention to it. But this is sort of wild. It's speculation, but I think that I look at the agenda, I look at how important this issue is for him, the East Asian issue is for him, and China's important, but apart from that, I don't see a big issue.
Thank you very much. Another question from the floor. Go ahead here in the back. We did, just for the record, we did try to get an India expert on this panel, but that's why there's only 4 of us up here today.
Oh, sorry. Along
And if you don't mind identifying yourself. Thank you.
Jessica Baker, I'm an analyst at Cision. And my question was along those same lines. Can you comment on the possibility or even current collaboration and cooperation with between the trilateral countries and India in the Indo-Pacific?
Any comments on Japan-India cooperation or South Korea-India cooperation? Yeah, South Korea is a little busy. How about Japan?
Japan already has framework like Quad. So this is going continue to be very important framework for Japan in terms of security policy. And I just thought about mentioning the ASEAN, the question about ASEAN, Japan's involvement. Prime Minister Ishiba recently visited Malaysia and Indonesia, and Malaysia, and so far this diplomatic approach was positively evaluated, like in Japan domestic, and like because ASEAN country has quite lots of impact from China, like including like sea lane, etc., etc. So Japan wants to maintain its presence in ASEAN countries. So Japan basically, that's why Japanese government, like what happened in Kishida's government, it actually shifted its security policy area from East Asia to Indo-Pacific, so kind of extending it through amending, updating the national security strategy. Yeah, that's something I want to mention.
And I would just add that I think that the coming years provide a number of opportunities for us to look at creative ways to bring Korea into a lot of the existing cooperation that the United States has through the Quad with Japan and Australia and India, as well as potentially through this trilateral grouping with Korea and Japan.
Thank you. I'll turn now to another question. Yes, sir.
My name's Matthew Bragg. I'm a graduate from St. Mary's College of Maryland. I have a question about the trilateral partnership. Is it possible that, similar to how Russia sees NATO as a threat, would this alliance potentially be seen as a threat to China as well? And is it possible that this trilateral cooperation would expand as well?
Who wants to take this on?
Happy to talk about China.
Sure.
Chinese media has been very concerned about the positions of strength that the Biden administration has created in the Indo-Pacific region. And they've been shrill about this. NATO involvement in these things is, of course, Korea and Japan and Australia and New Zealand are all involved with NATO now. And so the upshot of all this is that you have to say, at least from a media point of view, they take this very seriously. They see this as strategic encirclement. And so the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and the United States is seen as a very formidable position of strength that the Biden government has been creating throughout the region. The Quad is another one. Now that Mr. Biden has lost the election and he's gone, they're dismissing it right now. But at the time, they were quite concerned about this, and that's in the 2022, 2023. These things were all being created in a very effective way. And at the same time, there was building positions of strength inside the country with passage of legislation with a couple of $1 trillion worth of appropriations to deal with China. And so I think they took it quite seriously, and I think that's a fact. And I think they're glad that Mr. Trump is president on this issue, because he's not concerned about these sorts of things. He doesn't get into these kinds of alignments very much, and so so that's something that that's my observation on this.
Thank you. Any other comments on this question? Drew.
I'll jump in on this one as well. I think one of the key things that we should consider is that the United States, South Korea, and Japan are stronger standing together in the Indo-Pacific. And that is one of the key things that we have focused on with this trilateral grouping. Now, does that cause concern for partners that might view the United States, or countries, I should say, that might view the United States as an adversary? I imagine that yes, that probably does cause some concern. So we need to think about, where are we as the U.S. Positioning ourselves? Is that something that is putting us on a trajectory where we achieve peace through strength, as President Yoon has espoused as is his own personal slogan, and is that the way in which some of these other countries in the region are viewing the actions that the three countries are taking? So food for thought for all of us, but at the end of the day, what we have worked to achieve is a stronger trilateral grouping that, as you're suggesting, has knock-on effects not only for North Korea, but for the PRC and other countries in the region.
To wrap up this panel, I'd like to take two brief questions from the audience. Go ahead here in blue and in blue. Sorry, it's my favorite color. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Anna Schrans. I'm a Belgian student, graduated in international politics and currently studying international war studies. I just have a question directed at Mr. Drew Arverseth, regarding what you said about North Korea, about the US basically having no communication and no diplomatic ties with the country. I was wondering if this was a specific shift since the end of the Trump administration, or if this was more gradually, and also how do you see this unfolding under his second administration? And also, sorry, which specific efforts are actually used to build or restore this kind of diplomatic ties with a country such as North Korea?
Thank you. And our last and not least question.
My name is Michelle Whitty. This is, well, primarily for Mr. Arverseth, but there's been a lot of talk of institutionalizing different processes and agreements in this room and elsewhere. Sometimes it is very explicitly about Trump-proofing agreements and processes. And Mr. Arverseth mentioned institutionalizing processes such that public pressure from Japan, South Korea, the United States, that they could withstand this public pressure. So I wonder, as a member of the public, how should we feel about our ability to influence foreign policy electorally?
I guess, Drew, you get the last word on this panel.
Right. And I appreciate that question, because that was actually the topic of my master's thesis here at GW, of all places. So I will come back to you. But first, let me turn to the question on diplomacy with North Korea. And say, look, this North Korea's approach is not specific to the Biden administration. It is much more generally directed at the United States of America. So while there is certainly an opportunity for our incoming team and the Trump administration to re-engage North Korea, and we will, of course, be looking very closely at what that means, I do not think that we are in a position to expect that North Korea is going to fundamentally shift its views on things like denuclearization, shift its views on the way in which it engages with the international community, shift the way in which it's reaching out to Russia, or the way in which it is procuring materials for its WMD programs. So we need to consider all of those aspects when we think about diplomacy with North Korea, because as much as we may reach out through our diplomatic channels, through whatever channels we have at our disposal, whether that be directly from the United States or with our partners, North Korea is on the other side of the phone, and they always have the option of just not picking up. And that's where we're at. Now, with regard to my comments on being resilient with respect to public opinion in our three countries, let me qualify that by also saying that sometimes there are divergent views within the public that need to be considered. It's certainly something that policymakers look at very closely on a day-to-day basis. And at the end of the day, when you're in national security, ultimately the final word is what is going to be in the best interest for the security of whether it be the United States, the Republic of Korea, or Japan. And that really is the overarching goal for civil servants in national security. So that needs to be considered. Now, does the public have ability to weigh in on these national security decisions? Absolutely. And I think that we're increasingly seeing that not only here in the US, but also in Korea and Japan. Obviously, there are strongly held views in both Korea and Japan with regard to trilateral cooperation and their own bilateral relationship that we need to work within. But there are also strongly held views as to the way in which trilateral cooperation, as well as each country's bilateral cooperation with the United States, improves their security vis-a-vis potential challenges posed by the DPRK, by the PRC, and Russia too, for that matter. So I think that what we need to focus on is where are areas of cooperation trilaterally that we can achieve that fill some of those security needs that the public is looking for, that do not cross a red line in terms of perhaps some of the historical issues that remain very near and dear to the heart of many within the public. So it's a very fine line to walk, but I do think that there is a path forward where we can achieve some of our security interests that we have, that we share, without diving into or delving into areas that are overly sensitive for the public.
Thank you. We are basically out of time, but I do want to ask the other panelists if there's anything on these last two questions that you would like to respond to, or final words. Okay, you're standing between coffee and cookies. So please join me in thanking our four panelists for their excellent remarks this afternoon. Just a note, if you can leave your jacket or something over your chair, that would help us to know how many chairs are occupied, because there may be some turnover in the audience in the room for the second panel. But I do encourage you to partake of the cookies and coffee that are outside and return for panel 2, which will explore emerging issues. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The first draft of the Camp David script.
That Washington Declaration.
Washington Declaration. As I said, it is very, very important, significant, and even the progressive. I agree.
It's been a lot of work. We'll see where we end up.
across East, South, and Southeast Asia. These dynamics are sure to help shape U.S. engagement as well as broader developments across the Indo-Pacific. For this panel's event format, I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn, who will have about 5 to 7 minutes to deliver remarks. Then we will move on to audience Q&A. So allow me to take my seat and we'll get started with our discussion. All right, so for our first panelist, we have Professor Im-woo Kim, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at Sungkyunkwan University. His main research interests include history and geopolitics of oil, politics of alliances, and the Korean Peninsula. His works have either appeared or are forthcoming in International Studies Quarterly, Security Studies, Journal of Global Security Studies, Contemporary Security Policy, the Pacific Review, Foreign Affairs, and others. Professor Kim holds a PhD in political science from George Washington University. Love to see our alumni coming back, where he was also a research affiliate at the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. He holds a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of Oxford and received his MSc in politics of the world economy from London School of Economics. He's also a former recipient of the Fulbright Scholarship and previously taught at Korea Military Academy. He'll be speaking on the topic of From Standoff to Stability, Navigating Nuclear Challenges in the Korean Peninsula. If you wouldn't mind welcoming Professor Kim. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction. It's really great to be back to the Elliott School. I'm a proud product of GW Education, so I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be here and join this wonderful panel. I'm going to make 2 points in my, I guess, 5 to 7 minutes presentation. My first point would be that, when it comes to North Korea challenge, crisis stability is emerging as the critical challenge to the stability of the Korean Peninsula. My second point concerns, so what do we do about the worsening crisis stability? And the current approach by the Washington and Seoul has been, as Professor Bum-soo Kim mentioned in the first panel, has been the peace through strength. And my point would be that it's partly true, but trying to get more deterrence capability does have deterrence effect, but also it generates escalatory pressure on the relationship, on the crisis. So I think we need to be more careful about what kind of strength we need to have. And the more pressing priority for the North Korea challenge now is not the getting more strength, but the creation of crisis control mechanisms. So those are the 2 points I'm going to make in my presentation. So let me turn to my first point, which is the crisis stability. So crisis stability can be defined as a situation in which neither side has an incentive to launch a preemptive strike during a period of heightened tension. So if you have a naval clash in the West Sea, or the drones or the balloons flying over between the DMZ or exchange of fire in DMZ, that entails a risk of escalating into a war, or it can de-escalate into non-crisis situation. The crisis stability is not born equal, and scholars have found that 2 factors are important in determining the level of crisis stability. One is distribution of nuclear capability, and here the more asymmetric nuclear capabilities are between nuclear adversaries, more unstable the situation becomes. The second factor is crisis controllability. So the more crisis control mechanisms you have, obviously that means that you have a better ability to control the crisis and prevent crisis from becoming a full-scale war. And if you apply these variables to the context of the Korean Peninsula, you have a bad news. It's the asymmetric distribution of nuclear capability, and there are virtually no crisis control mechanisms. So the scholars call these firestorm scenarios. the structural factors are not so favorable to the crisis stability. And if you look at what the United States, South Korea, and North Korea have been doing in the last 4 years, that adds even more fuel to the situation. So some of the factors that have worsened crisis stability include the modernization and expansion of nuclear forces in North Korea, revision of nuclear law in September 2022, which while being deterrence and defense oriented, nevertheless lowers a threshold for early nuclear use in North Korea. Also, there has been a constant effort to strengthen South Korea's counterforce capability. And also US and South Korea has been pushing for greater and more intense military build-up, peace through strength postures. So all of these have been worsening the crisis stability. And then you have the breakdown of the comprehensive military agreement, or otherwise known as, also known as the September 19th agreement. So if you look at what has been happening in the last 4 years, everything has gone worse effectively. And so what it means is that Korea is facing a higher and more intense risk of inadvertent escalation. So that leads to my second point. So what do we do about this situation? Given the worsening crisis stability, I argue that the United States and South Korea must begin to think about unilateral and bilateral measures to control crisis stability. If we have the crisis control mechanisms, South Korea, United States will not be the first to do it, because crisis control mechanisms have widespread presence between nuclear adversaries around the globe, and have proven to be valuable source for communication between adversaries, valuable source to reduce anxiety and fear during military crisis, and reduce uncertainty that can cause inadvertent escalation. So the examples of crisis control mechanisms working would include the war in Ukraine. So if you look at the war in Ukraine, it has not escalated into nuclear war, despite Russia being the nuclear state and United States being the nuclear state. And one mechanism that helped to control this crisis has been the advanced notification. So the Russians have been testing their ICBMs and missiles during the war in Ukraine, but they notified the United States in advance. So, so from US point of view, the notification reduced the chance of their missile test being misperceived as an act of nuclear war. Another case in point is the Kargil war between India and Pakistan in 1999. So again, India and Pakistan are nuclear states. They went to war back in 1999, but the level of military conflict remained below the nuclear threshold. And one of the contributing factors to this has been high-level communication between the leadership between India and Pakistan. So these are the examples of crisis control mechanisms we have, and I hope that that's a lesson that Seoul and Washington must take when it comes to their ability to control the crisis. They must recognize that there's no guarantee that crisis will not escalate, but you have to put in a lot of effort to control them. And it means that they need to be thinking about how to formulate a strategy to get North Korea into crisis control mechanisms. To be fair, Washington has been talking about this since last year. They mentioned interim agreement for risk reduction measures, but that was not received favorably in Seoul. The Seoul thought this would have an effect of recognizing North Korea's nuclear program. So it met with strong resistance in Seoul. I think this is misguided, and yet it shows how much opposition there is and political obstacles there are when it comes to introducing crisis control mechanisms. So some of the examples, some of the things we can do would include the hotline creation, notification measures, coming to agreeing on to code of conduct during crisis, or even unilateral declaration about the willingness to negotiate. I'm going to end. I'm not naive about the political challenges to make these measures happen. Again, the oppositions are everywhere. North Korea, as Drew mentioned in the first panel, has not been responsive to Washington's outreach for the last 4 years. But I think theory and history of nuclear weapons are quite clear that in the relationship between nuclear adversaries, you do not only need deterrence capability, but also you need the willingness to talk, communicate, and coordinate to serve the shared interest of avoiding unnecessary, unintended, inadvertent war involving nuclear weapons. So crisis control mechanisms is not pro-North Korea policy. This is a pro-stability policy. And I hope that this gets more attention among Seoul and Washington. All right, stop it here.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim, for your opening remarks. Next, we have Ilaria Mazzocco, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and part of the Public Intellectuals Program with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. She has over a decade of experience researching industrial policy, Chinese climate policy, and the intersection between the energy transition and economic and national security. Prior to joining CSIS, she led research on Chinese climate and energy policy for Macropolo, the Paulson Institute's think tank. She holds a PhD from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where her dissertation investigated Chinese industrial policy. She holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins SAIS and Central European University, as well as a bachelor's degree from Bard College. She speaks Chinese and Italian, and she'll be speaking on opportunities and challenges that lie ahead for U.S.-China relations under Trump 2.0, especially regarding economics, trade, climate, and energy security. Thank you for talking.
Well, thank you so much for having me, despite being a SAIS graduate and not a GW graduate, but it is an honor to be here, and it's always fun to actually talk to a live audience, which since COVID has become more of a rarity. So I think I'm going to be talking a little bit about what the emerging challenges that the Trump administration will be facing. I think there's a lot of question marks, and I think that's something that we should probably be keeping in mind. But I think when we're looking at this, it's clear that there's some challenges that are going to be inherited from the Biden administration. In some cases, these are challenges or situations or policies that haven't been inherited by the Biden administration from the Trump 1 administration and even from the Obama administration, especially when it comes to some of the economic security issues. But others are evolving challenges that really have more to do with the changing environment globally, China's own posturing and trends internationally, and also, Trump administration's policies itself. So I think there's four broad buckets. We have sort of economic and trade policy challenges. We have others that fall under what I would call economic security or tech competition challenges. Others have more to do with global governance, as I would define it. And finally, more in the security realm, which I will be talking less about because I think we have far more expertise here in the room relative to mine. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that the security environment and national security concerns are increasingly shaping all the other emerging areas of concern. So I think, taking a closer look at what this means in practice, in the economic realm, I think we'll be continuing to hear conversations and, concern over capacity, trade with China. But I think we'll also be hearing a lot more about trade surpluses. And here, as a parenthesis, I think one big difference under Trump administration, the incoming administration, but also Trump 1, compared to the Biden administration, is that a lot of the challenges that have to do with China and a lot of the relationship with the policies towards China are going to not be as unique in the sense of What I mean is that, for example, in the case of trade, we're going to be seeing concerns and tension over trade surpluses with a lot of countries, including partners and allies. So it's not going to be sort of a China unique story. It's going to be a broader priority for the administration. So we'll be hearing a lot about tariffs. Again, China will not be unique in this part of the story. Of course, China is, in many ways unique just because of its size and also because of its sort of priority as a national security concern. I think there's other questions that will also be important for the Trump administration. What happens to China's economy, right? A lot of question marks as to where China's economy is headed and what the Chinese government is going to do. There's a lot of expectations of new stimulus measures, but so far those stimulus measures that have been introduced have not been sufficient. We've not seen a lot of movement in consumption, household consumption specifically. So a lot of question marks on what they can do, what they will do, will it be enough, and also will there actually be response in the economy. Finally, a couple of notes on the economic side, which are slightly, I would say, less less in the limelight, but I think will become pretty important, could become important. One is the question of market access. This has not been really a conversation point in recent years, but it used to be. And there is a possibility that we might hear more talk about actual deals under a Trump administration. I wouldn't say this is highly likely, but it's certainly something to sort of keep in mind. The other is Chinese FDI in the United States. I think here instead, this is becoming increasingly a topic, especially in some of the strategic or next generation technologies. And I think I would keep an eye on that and where that conversation goes. It's been quite politicized. On the economic security side, and I'll be brief, but we've seen now a slew of new announcements and rules over the past week by the outgoing Biden administration. I do not expect the Trump administration to take a very different stance on a lot of these issues. I think we'll see probably continued continuing on the same line in terms of export controls and restrictions on strategic technologies. I think one area to watch again that will, we're already seeing this development under the Biden administration, but I think it will be strengthened and continued along the same line is concerns over data and connectivity. This is making it so that industries and technologies that traditionally have not been in the sphere of national security are becoming part of national security. So the automotive sector, port cranes, Wi-Fi routers, right? And many different technologies are now that you're traditionally we're seeing more civilian technologies are now coming under sort of more scrutiny from a national security perspective. So this is going to become, I think, more and more of a challenge. Everybody mentioned strategic technology, semiconductors, I think is going to continue to be at the center of that. I think what's going to be interesting, and this is already, I think, become clear with some of the rules that have been announced over the past week, is that there's going to be some interesting questions as to the role of allies. The Biden administration spoke a lot about allies. They were they were actually quite important to the architecture of its export controls on semiconductors. It is unclear if that's going to continue to be the case under a Trump administration. And so I think actually how the Trump administration engages with allies when it comes to these economic security concerns is again, I think we have a sense that it's going to be different. Exactly how that's going to be when it comes to specific rules, specific technologies is kind of an open question, but it's certainly something to watch. And I would expect some changes there. And as I said, I think there might have already been some evolution in the Biden administration's approach with the new AI diffusion rule and different tiers of who gets access to semiconductors and who doesn't. I think the European Union being broken up into different tiers is an interesting case there. Finally, global governance. I think what's going to be interesting is actually watching the space that the U.S. cedes on the global governance space, right? And so talking about examples of climate governance, so COP, talk about maybe leaving even the UNFCCC, but certainly I think, we can all expect the Trump administration to leave the Paris Agreement, but also, the multilateral trading system, or just more broadly, the global international order. Interesting role here for U.S. allies and let's say developed OECD countries, Western countries, and how they decide to actually continue to engage with these institutions and maybe defend them, and what that says vis-a-vis China, where in some cases China may be able to take a more of a leadership role or not. So I think I will leave it there, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, a fellow with the Wilson Center's Asia program, where he produces analysis on Southeast Asian political and security issues, Asian defense affairs, and U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific. He is also the CEO and founder of ASEAN Wonk Global, a research hub that produces the weekly ASEAN Wonk Bullet Brief newsletter, senior columnist at The Diplomat, one of Asia's leading current affairs publications, and an advisor at the Bauer Group Asia. His new book, Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy, published in 2022, develops and applies an original balance of commitment approach to examining U.S. commitment in Southeast Asia over the past half century. And I've asked him to speak today on the topic of challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for U.S.-ASEAN relations under Trump 2.0, which, as Professor Bob Sutter commented on the first panel today, maybe there's interest or lack of interest there, and we will soon discover, as well as the political, diplomatic, and security environment in Southeast Asia that will contextualize these dynamics. Dr. Parameswaran holds a PhD and Master of Arts from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, focused on international security, international business, and U.S. foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming for his remarks.
Southeast Asia is an extremely diverse region, 11 born and raised there. And so rather than me just talk about my own opinion and commentary, I thought what I'd rather do is I just actually came back from a trip where I was in several of these Southeast Asian countries. I traveled to 10 of the 11 countries last year for a couple of reports I was doing with the Wilson Center. And obviously, even though I was interested in talking about the region, everybody was asking me about what's going to happen in the US elections here. So I thought what I would do is kind of share 3 buckets of sort of opportunities and challenges that countries in the region are thinking about and how they're thinking about the United States more generally. And I would say there are sort of 3 categories: the sort of bilateral, the regional, and the global. I think bilaterally, you tend to see in Southeast Asia a bit of friendly competition between various countries, not sort of alien to other parts of the world as well, of countries just kind of vying for influence, sort of, having deals between the administration, whatever administration that might be, on areas of, say, geoeconomics, critical minerals, for example, semiconductors. There's a lot of friendly competition that goes on there, a lot of diplomatic engagement. I think there, different countries will see their fortunes kind of rise and fall. There was a Trump risk index that The Economist put out a few months before the election, and 3 of the Southeast Asian countries were on there. Vietnam was on there for trade, the Philippines was on there for security and spending a little less on defense than the Trump administration might like, and Singapore, interestingly, was there on immigration, on issues like student visas, for example. But if you look at those 3 countries all managed the first Trump administration actually pretty well. They extracted concessions. They convinced the Trump administration that they're going to do a lot more on things like North Korea, for example. They managed a lot of the trade deficit questions. So if you talk to the elites and governments in these countries, they actually feel quite confident about managing the bilateral aspect of that conversation. I think where you see a bit of concern is in the smaller countries in Southeast Asia, which perceive, rightly or wrongly, that under a Trump administration, there will be a lot of time for big countries. So the Indonesias of the world, significant countries like Vietnam, for example, but not so much, countries like Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, for example. What will these countries get out of a Trump administration that might be focused more selectively on certain countries and sort of the notion of what have you done for the United States lately? That's a question that you can ask, countries like the Philippines, for example, that's a treaty ally. I'm not so sure how that conversation will go with Laos, right? Which is a country which is facing its own developing problems. And frankly, if you talk to Laotians about the US legacy in Laos, I mean, it was mostly the fact that that country was blown to bits by the United States. More bombs dropped on Laos, more so than World War II as a whole, right? During that time. So it is a interesting conversation depending on which country you talk to. I think on the regional lens, what you see is a tension between minilaterals and multilaterals. ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the diplomatic organization which Pete Hegseth, during his hearing recently, earlier this week, was not able to identify, in terms of U.S. interests and allies and partners, which I can tell you, a lot of my WhatsApp groups from the region have been, sort of flaring up about, what does this mean for U.S. policy and what the Trump administration says. I'll focus less on that because I think that's more on the perception side rather than the actual policy. But it does give you a sense about the signal to noise ratio that the region and individuals in the region are thinking about. But in terms of ASEAN itself, it's a diplomatic organization that's been pretty successful in terms of managing relations between Southeast Asian countries, which during the Cold War, which was pretty hot in Southeast Asia, were essentially at odds with each other, right? Some of them questioning independence of other countries, lots of territorial encroachments, and so on and so forth. But on issues like the South China Sea and Myanmar, the two big flashpoints that are undermining Southeast Asia right now, that organization is facing a lot of challenges. Now, on the multilateral side, that's a reality. But frankly, if you talk to individuals in the region about what they see as the Biden administration's big contribution on regional architecture, it's actually not on multilaterals, it's on minilaterals, right? Which is the sort of notion of, if you look at the Philippines, for example, they're now part of the US, Japan, Philippines trilateral. But the rest of the region really isn't embedded in this US minilateral framework. A lot of the Southeast Asian countries prefer this sort of stance of engaging with the United States, but also engaging with China and not forming sort of exclusive clubs and being part of exclusive clubs. So you've seen Singapore, for example, enter a technology partnership with the United States. But that's not saying that it is exclusive of what Singapore can do economically with China, for example. You've seen upgrades with the US relationship with Indonesia and the US relationship with Vietnam, which are the kind of the two big pillars in Southeast Asia. But these are countries that are still going to do business with China economically and on trade, especially since, as we've heard previously, there isn't much of an affirmative value proposition on trade and market access coming from the United States. So US businesses continue to invest heavily in Southeast Asia. And the United States is extremely competitive that way. But the issue for the US government is, well, if all the attention is coming from business, then these governments are just going to engage business on economic and trade issues. And if the administration is asking them to hedge with respect to what they're doing with China, or what they're doing with the US, what is the value proposition that the US government and the Trump administration is offering that is going to lead these countries to move closer to the United States when they can actually get some of these benefits and rewards from businesses? And then I would just say, lastly, on the global side, there is this notion, it's not a very neat notion, but this notion of the global South does have some traction in parts of Southeast Asia, which I said, the tradition of non-alignment in the region is not a very happy one. It lasted for a very short period. It was undermined by a lot of Sino-Soviet tensions between India and Indonesia. So it's not a very glorified legacy, I would say. But nonetheless, I mean, these realities and the sentiment in the region is very heavily felt. And it's not surprising, right? If you look at the conversation on artificial intelligence, the UN's own estimate is that all of the G7 members are part of all 7 of the frameworks that we have going on in AI right now. Over 100 countries, mostly developing countries, are not even involved in any of those frameworks, right? A lot of low-income countries are spending more on debt servicing than they are on health and education after the pandemic. So this is a really, really wrought and fraught series of issues that I think, even as we're thinking about what a Trump administration means for individual Southeast Asian countries, there are really fundamental questions about global order that these countries are wrestling with. And this whole notion, we had 2 or 3 decades ago, that the United States is going to be a leader in this order, it's going to engage, it's going to allow countries to sort of,
do trade with them, promote market access. I think a lot of these countries recognize now that that is not something to be taken for granted. What the world in which I think one policymaker sort of described to me his views, which is, U.S. leadership is going to be more selective, right? It's going to be in certain domains, but not in others. And even in places where the United States is leading, it is going to ask countries to do more. Some of those countries are going to be willing to do more. Other countries are not going to be either be able to or not going to be willing to do so. And the question there is, what happens in that sort of environment where we have global governance that is more fractured? And I would just end by saying this. The big statistic that you see coming out of the region is the fact that there is a institute called the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore that does an annual survey of what are perceptions in Southeast Asia of the United States and China. For this year, for the first time, over 50% of countries said that, if we're going to be forced to choose between the United States and China, we're going to pick China. We're not going to pick the United States. That's a pretty significant finding. If you drill down into the specifics, it's largely because you saw a lot of movements with respect to the Israel-Gaza issue, particularly in Muslim Southeast Asia. But it goes to show you, though, that in spite of the fact that we're talking about a region and regional states, global issues do cut different ways in Southeast Asia. So how the Trump administration approaches global issues, whether it's Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, the global South, global governance, these are going to be really important. And I would say they could turn out to be the most important layer that I talked about among these three. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Prashant. Next, we have Anne Kowalski, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute, who has a decade of experience in think tank, government, and private sector on Indo-Pacific policy. Annie led the Indo-Pacific portfolio as a senior professional staff member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she managed legislation and oversight regarding strategic competition with the People's Republic of China, U.S. policy towards Taiwan, alliance management, and the U.S. diplomatic and security posture in the region. She also served as an Indo-Pacific senior policy analyst on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 3 years. Prior to serving on the Hill, Ms. Kowalski spent 4 years researching Indo-Pacific issues at various think tanks, including the American Enterprise Institute, Georgetown Center for Security Studies, and the United States Institute of Peace. She received her MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University and her LLB with honors from the University of Edinburgh School of Law. She'll be speaking on the most significant opportunities and challenges that lie ahead for U.S.-Taiwan relations under Trump 2.0 and beyond. Thanks so much, Anne, for your remarks.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks to all the organizers for this panel, and thanks for welcoming behind enemy lines as a Georgetown alum. I thought I would kind of speak first to Trump's approach to the region and then focus in on Taiwan. And of course, everyone loves to overgeneralize the Trump administration, so why not give it a go? Trump has obviously been known to be unpredictable, and it's debatable how much of that unpredictability is baked into a grander strategy or not. But amongst all the unpredictability of the president, I think he's been remarkably consistent on 2 issues in particular, and we can definitely expect him to use those frameworks in his approach to the region as well. The first is on trade. I think if there's one thing to take away on Trump trade policy is that trade policy is domestic policy. I'll say it again, trade policy is domestic policy. This is about American industrialization. It's about protecting American manufacturing. It's about American jobs. Every consideration about trade, tariffs, potential sanctions, deals or no deals, all comes down to how it affects the American manufacturing base and American economy. So the first trade, and this also trade is kind of the fundamental underpinning for a lot of Trump's view on foreign policy as well. If you talk to Trump advisors from the first administration, a lot of them do say that, well, before the president would go meet with foreign dignitaries, the first thing he would ask is, well, what's our trade deficit with this country? And he would use that to shape his engagement and the way that he postures himself in those foreign policy meetings. So trade, very, very important. And the second area where Trump has been incredibly consistent is burden sharing. It's clear that he wants other countries to take on a broader share of this, particularly security burden sharing. And we've seen this most saliently in Europe from statements and other types of coercive actions and rhetoric. but that also applies to East Asia and Southeast Asia. We can expect there to be a pretty big push from the Trump administration to ensure that the Asian countries are taking the regional security issues seriously and protecting themselves likewise. That is not to say that, we're not going to see a repeat of the first Trump administration where there's threats to pull back troops in Asia, but I just do think it will depend. The approach that he takes to security in the Indo-Pacific will depend on the level of seriousness that they assess that the Asian countries have of their own security. So on Taiwan in particular, President Trump himself has said a lot about Taiwan, including they've stolen our semiconductors. The famous Bolton quote about Taiwan is the tip of this pen and China is this whole table, so why would I care about Taiwan? And other not encouraging comments. However, we've also seen in Trump's appointments that he has taken in a lot of very strong Taiwan hands and Taiwan voices, including Senator Rubio, Representative Waltz, and on the National Security Council, it's been announced that Ivan Kanapathy, who has a very strong Taiwan background, will also be leading the Asia Directorate there. So the themes that I would like to present on kind of Trump administration approaches to Taiwan are a couple, and then happy to go into detail in the question and answer session. So the first is that despite having very strong national security voices in the Trump administration, we can't discount the fact that they are still a minority amongst the broader administrative, political positioning. And it still remains unclear whether or not they're going to have the dominant voice, right? President Trump in his first administration famously likes to have meetings where there's a lot of different views presented in front of him and people have an active debate in front of him and then he makes a decision based on that debate. And we're seeing that he's staffing his cabinet in the same way, and we see him staffing the NSC in the same way. So you do have some national security hardliners that are going to be pushing for engagement, for a much stronger deterrence posture in the Indo-Pacific, for more defense funding, and so on. But you also have, the kind of, I'd say, like straightforward econ folks that are going to be looking at, no, we need to actually focus just on kind of like U.S. domestic industry. So it's really unclear quite right now, like where the centers of gravity are, but that's going to be a very active debate within the Trump administration that's going to bleed into how he approaches the region. On Taiwan in particular, this obviously means I think we've already laid out some good opportunities for countries to come in the very beginning and provide opportunities for investment and other types of resources to bolster U.S. manufacturing. But I think, we've also seen signals from Congress that they are looking to expand the trading relationship with Taiwan, most notably the anti-double taxation pieces that have passed just this week in the House. Historically, on U.S. policy in Taiwan, you have the administration, but then you have Congress, right? Our fundamental legislative and foundation for the way that we approach Taiwan policy is still the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979. And that act was a response from Congress to Jimmy Carter's decision to normalize relations with the PRC. So I think we have to remember that historically, Congress has always viewed Taiwan policy as their thing. And that has certainly not changed in the past couple of years. We've seen a slew of Taiwan legislation come from Congress, and that legislation has gone, hit pretty much every aspect of our relationship with Taiwan, from the economic side with anti-double taxation and even proponents of a free trade agreement with Taiwan, to amending State Department guidelines to expand our diplomatic presence in Taiwan. So I think Congress will remain key and a key voice on Taiwan, despite the fact of Representative Waltz and Senator Rubio moving over into the administration. I think Congress will become even more of a key voice because, as I said, there's the hardliners, unclear if they're going to have the main dominant voice, but I can definitely see the shrewd politicians that those two are, but leveraging the power of Congress to push forward policy that the administration might not be willing to do so entirely on its own in the executive branch. The second main theme on Taiwan, I think, is the volatility that we're facing in the Taiwan Strait. Of course, we've heard a ton about it, but I think fundamentally, the reasons are just that the nonviolent options for Xi Jinping to get the only outcome that he has made acceptable to him, which is Taiwan under CCP rule. The nonviolent options are just falling off the table, right? You have Taiwan that's trying to insulate its economy from Chinese economic influence. You have a pretty concerted like disinformation and pressure media campaign to try to, win the hearts and minds of the Taiwanese citizens. And that's just not going, you see the polling showing that the Taiwanese identity is becoming even more strong after that. So the nonviolent options really aren't there for Xi to get what he has promised and the only acceptable outcome for him, which is Taiwan under CCP rule. And as we, those trend lines are not necessarily changing in the near future. So I think as, these other nonviolent options start falling off the table, I think we have to be very serious about the future of Taiwan as an independently governed island. And then I think if you take the third theme I want to point out is if you take the hardliners and the admin, but you mix it with the shifting balance of power in the Taiwan Strait and the volatility that I spoke about before, and then you add in a Congress that has had trouble funding our defense for the past 15 or so years, then you add in the defense industrial base challenges that we have and actually getting, Taiwan the weapons that it has already bought or just keeping up with our current stockpiles. We have a difficulty now in not only like will and political will on Taiwan and in the Taiwan Strait, now we have a difficulty of capability. And I think this is very much overlooked in a lot of policymakers. The question is always, oh, but will we go in on Taiwan? Will we not? I think the question really is, do we have the capability to promise, what some folks are suggesting that we promise in terms of Taiwan's defense? And this is going to be a short-term challenge that I think is going to factor into the Trump administration's decision-making, in addition to kind of the foreign policy and the hardliners' views on what we should be doing in the Indo-Pacific. The other question is, what do we have the capability to do? Thanks.
Thank you so much. And for our final panelist, we have Professor Tashi Rabgi, Research Professor of International Affairs at the Elliott School, where she specializes in statehood, authoritarianism, and territorial politics, with a focus on multi-level governance and the politics of scale in the People's Republic of China. She also works on constitutional and international legal issues relating to the special status arrangements of asymmetric states and autonomous regions in comparative global contexts. Her primary regional focus is Tibet and Greater China, with a specialization in the Sino-Tibetan dispute. At the Elliott School, she directs the Research Initiative on Multi-Nation States, or RIMS, which convenes a Track-2 dialogue process with policy researchers in Beijing on state asymmetry and territorial autonomy. She is also founding director of the Tibet Governance Lab, a research platform and incubator for policy research on Tibet, and also the co-founder of Machik, a global nonprofit that has delivered strategies for Tibetan language education, community empowerment, and civic engagement in Tibet for over 20 years. She's been a fellow in the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and a visiting scholar at Sichuan University. She holds a PhD from Harvard University, as well as law degrees from Oxford and Cambridge, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. And she'll speak on the current state of China-India relations and how Tibet remains a factor in that geopolitical setting. Professor Rabgi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And I want to say thank you to all the organizers for putting this event together very timely, given the circumstances here in Washington, and in particular for allowing me to speak about Sino-Indian relations, something I don't usually get to comment on, but there is a lot to think about, I think, given all the changes that we've seen over the past, particularly the 6 months preceding. It is a time of China-India rapprochement, which we saw from the October agreement coming out of BRICS in this past year. So since that time, we're seeing a lot of talk about talking, and we expect a lot of dialogue and exchanges have begun, but we'll probably see a lot of the restrictions that have been in place since 2020, when there was violent clashes along the border, to be lifted. Things like, for example, direct flights, passenger flights are still restricted between India and China. But what does this mean? Is this a geopolitical shift? Is this a tactical thaw? Is this India hedging its bets in this transactional era of global affairs that we're coming into? One of the things that we've seen with the October Agreement was that certainly the military standoff has come to an end. And what that is basically 3,500 kilometers of an ill-defined border where the line of actual control has been constantly shifting, and troops on either side meet face to face, which has led to skirmishes over the years, certainly since 2017. That has intensified and led to the various clashes. So that is something that is going to come to an end because they have now procedures for patrolling agreements and such. But I think what the October Agreement particularly showed is the difference in vision between India and China on what they have in mind in terms of their relationship. India talked about a multipolar Asia, and certainly China did not in the agreement. So basically, we are seeing Indian overtures to Beijing. And I think it's fair to say that India has an eye on China's dominance in the global supply chain, and especially with the nearshoring and friendshoring on the part of the US and other Western liberal democracies, India has demonstrated a strong interest in plugging itself into China's supply chain. And that is understandable. China is India's #1 import trade partner, number two partner overall in trade. And as India grows into the third largest economy by the end of the decade, I think there's interest on both sides in Delhi and Beijing to offset whatever is to come in terms of this new transactional global era before us. And that said, I think it's important to see this is happening in the context of China not being what China has been over the past 25, 30 years of its ascendancy. It goes without saying the economic stagnation of its growth, the meltdown of many core pieces of its engine, the overcapacity problem, all happening in the middle of a demographic collapse in China. We've also just seen this extraordinary period of time where the Chinese foreign minister, the Chinese defense minister, two top generals charged with nuclear arsenals have all one by one disappeared, and no accountability in the global public about why that is the case. These are people who are handpicked by Xi Jinping, who then with no explanation are not to be found. So we are in a period of securitization, which we've heard a lot about, but as Odd Arne Westad has reminded us, that securitization is targeted primarily, #1, to its own domestic public. That is the China reality. And in the midst of this reality, this is where I think we see it's really important to understand the decision-making implications in Delhi and in Beijing. When they talk about the border dispute, and they talk about it as these skirmishes and in terms of these patrol arrangements, I think what is willfully looked away from is that beyond that border lies 2.5 million square kilometers of a very specific geography, a plateau where it's over estimated 80% Tibetan. So it's a majority Tibetan population on a very large territory, which is a quarter of the PRC territory, where Beijing has a consent to rule problem. It continues to have a consent to rule problem. So what we've seen over the past years of China's rise, different approaches, strategic approaches to the region that lies between India and China. We saw a moderate approach through the 80s that led to an uprising in the late 80s, 87, 88. We saw this dual approach of carrot and stick under Hu Jintao's rule to the point Xi Jinping's ascendancy, which also led to an uprising in 2008. And as someone who has studied that process, nobody saw it coming. The Tibetan uprising in 2008 was surprising to everybody, including some of the most dissident Tibetans inside Tibet. Didn't see it coming. Some of the top intellectuals who are very concerned about these things did not see it coming. So that period also led to an uprising. What we've seen since Xi Jinping's ascendancy is the most ill-conceived set of policies in the Tibetan region, including the extreme assimilationism in terms of language policy, in terms of every kind of dimension, actually. What Xi Jinping thought, of course, is a China statewide project, political project. So it's not just Tibet; it's across the entire Chinese state. But it hits differently in Tibet for sure. And at the same time, we're seeing the kinds of policies that lead to tremendous resentment, like the building of many dams, which lead to the relocation of communities. So we are seeing a Tibetan population that is not a minority at all. This is the part that's, I think, not seen very clearly, particularly in India, is that to the Tibetan region, which is the size of Western Europe, continues to be a Tibetan majority, and that majority is more heightened in its consciousness because of the kinds of policies that are being implemented right now, leading to a seeding of instability of the entire a very large region that lies beyond the border. So the border is really not about that border. It's really about this very large region in between that is not factoring into the conversations on Sino-Indian relations. So in the meantime, while this is all happening, what we were seeing just in the last month is, first of all, continuation of the building of entire villages across that border frontier. So it's building a lot of villages along that border on the PRC side, but it's also in the disputed territories. There's a lot of disputed territory, chunks of areas between India and the Chinese state, and also actually in other territories. So you maybe have heard about the fact that within, for example, Bhutan, there are villages, entire villages being built by the Chinese government. So there's that projection of state, which is very much an analog to the South China Sea territory building. And at the same time, on December 25th, the mega dam has been approved, which has been talked about for a long time, but it's just been formally approved. This is going to be 3 times the size of the Three Gorges Dam, which is currently the world's largest dam. This is going to cost $137 billion, a trillion yuan. That's the estimation now, but it's being built on a tectonic plate, so it's understood that this is going to lead to seismic problems. And it's funny, because not funny, but just after it was announced, 3 earthquakes took place inside the Tibetan regions, just as a sort of a reminder that this is going to have tremendous implications. This mega dam is being built just kilometers away from the line of actual control to India. So raising alarm in terms of the potential to redirect water. This is the fresh water that on the Tibetan side is called the Yarlung becomes the Brahmaputra. On the Indian side flows both to the Indian states as well as to Bangladesh before going out to the Bay of Bengal. So there's a lot of questions in terms of what the intentions are, and I think underlying that a great deal of lack of trust in terms of the direction of that. The chair of the China construction of power corporation, Yan Zhiyong, has stated that this dam is a matter of national security, and that it will lead to smoothing out, is the language that he used, the smoothing out of cooperation in South Asia down the road. So that it was just approved. At the same time, 2 new counties were established and announced just days after that that approval, which are also located in the disputed territories. So on the one hand, I think what we're seeing on the India side is this hedging of bets because we are entering this transactional era. And at the same time, this willful looking away from the longer term implications of what China continues to do along the border, inside the border, inside the various Himalayan countries, and not having that really play a part in the decision making. Can I say that I was at the South Asia Studies Institute of Sichuan University for several months, and was really, really surprised the degree to which the thinking on India amongst some of the academics there was so foundational at the just being generated for the first time. So it was very much an experience of encountering each other for the first time. So I think that really underlined the newness of the relationship between India and China in terms of how it is engaging with each other. And on a larger perspective, what I think this shows is that we are in this period of growing authoritarian rule, growing strongmen in every kind of context, and a big part of that seems to be this short-term thinking on how decisions are going to be made. And I just wanted to leave that as a thought.
All right, thanks so much for those great remarks as well. We'll move on to our Q&A portion. I'll go ahead and just prompt just a first question to give folks enough time to jot down your questions. And those of us joining online as well, please submit your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Just after listening to everyone's remarks here, just a few themes that caught my attention include communication, continuity, and complexity. Communication into how strategies are being conveyed and what are the specific mechanisms, bilateral, multilateral, minilateral, that are going to be signaling or filtering noise. Continuity in actually thinking about the areas of continuity or consistency with both Biden administration and Trump 1.0 in this region, some of the policy directions that are going to remain the same or fairly consistent. And then also at the same time, complexity, looking at the domestic political environments in all countries in the region, as well as the growing complex nature and interconnectedness of the geoeconomic and security dimensions. Just picking on the communication aspect, for all the panelists, whoever wants to join, I'm curious to hear what in each of the sections that you were describing, what are going to be some of the, what you see, main communication channels that U.S. foreign policy apparatus may be willing to invest in, if that's going to be something on bilateral front or usage of mini multilaterals or not at all. But I'm really interested in hearing about, who do you see will be doing some of the talking or discussion, and which of these channels or institutions will maybe be more valued than previously or remain the same. So open question, anyone who wants to talk about that.
Well, they are excellent comments on how we think about the challenges we face. And when it comes to communication for North Korea problem, and I was looking at some of the articles looking at Iran nuclear program, and I think a lot of policy proposals on that issue has been creation of back channel communication, because the public outreach to either Iran or North Korea is politically risky, and there's no guarantee that you will they will be responsive to those proposals. So I think back channel communication has been a favored way of reaching out and testing the water about the prospect of communication. And I believe that might be the least costly and least risky way of gauging the interest of communication with the either North Korea or Iran. But that was my speculation.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The back channels are the way to test the waters. I think if you want something pushed over the edge into actual action, it is going to require kind of direct communication with the White House and Trump himself. We saw in the first administration that he really likes being the one to sign the paperwork for the deal, and he considers himself the deal maker. So I think, having that high level, leader to leader communication is going to be really important, kind of in the last stages of any type of action that countries are looking for.
Yeah, I would just to quickly add to that, I would say, in addition to the government channels, which I agree will be really important, what Anne said about, Trump wanting to be the person signing off on documents and things of that sort. I really think there's no substitute for that in terms of official engagement. I would say there also needs to be a greater focus on U.S. narrative promotion. I do sense we may not believe it here in this room, and in much of Washington, sometimes it's a bit of a bubble. But if you go out to the region, there is this growing narrative of American decline. And it's relative decline, not absolute decline, but it's something which I think we have to take seriously. The notion that, US leadership, a lot of things that we used to take for granted are not there anymore. And when you have China and Beijing constantly reminding countries in the region that we're here, America is really far away. Every 4 years, you have an election. You may not like us, but at least we have a continuous policy that you disagree with. A lot of these countries, there's a lot of traction within the populations of these countries when China produces projects that, granted, have huge environmental issues, debt issues, so on and so forth. There still is a proportion of that population that is being swayed by this narrative. And I think if you look at the statistics, the ironical thing is, if you thought the United States was in decline 4 years ago, look at the direction of the US economy now. The US in 1990 was about 40% or 2/5 of the G7 countries. Today, that's about over 50%. So the American economy is actually an extremely positive story. The problem is we're not really doing a good job of telling that story in the region. And these countries don't really understand the link between a US economy that's doing really well and what are the tangible benefits that are coming to them for their countries, but also their individual populations, because we're increasingly talking here about our national interests and the American population and so on and so forth. So it has to get really specific. I mean, on if a country is not expecting infrastructure projects that are high risk and the US government can't do that, how do we work with allies and partners to be able to create a value proposition to be able to substitute for what China's doing? That's incredibly difficult, right? Easier said than done, but I do think we need that narrative piece of the conversation. And the other thing I would say is, I think often we overlook this and we think, oh, this is very soft stuff, people to people exchanges. And I can tell you safely, I mean, you look at the governments in these countries and the elites and the leaders, you see huge numbers of people who have studied the United States. Doesn't mean they're going to be very pro-US in any way, but at least they have an understanding that when they understand the United States and a new US president, US administration comes in, that doesn't change the whole infrastructure of the US government that involves state governments, local governments, universities, private companies. Them understanding the United States itself is a big strength for the United States to kind of understand how complex our system is. So you can't just talk about, oh, Trump has come in, so US policy has changed 180 degrees. It's a very simplistic understanding of a very complex system.
Well, I basically agree with everything that's been said. I was just going to add something on the communication, I think it will be really interesting to see who actually leads the China policy. I think it's a little too early. We know now who's in key positions. We don't fully have a full picture of what all the teams will be. But we also don't know who's going to be more influential, right? So I think that's just going to take quite a bit of time actually to figure out. And I think actually something that's worth noting in this panel, we're all focused on Asia, is that and the Indo-Pacific is that the Indo-Pacific may not be the main concern on day one. I think, the Middle East is going to be a big priority right now. On the trade front, USMCA is going to take up a lot of mental space and a lot of, I think, the airwave space in Washington for the next year or so. So that doesn't mean that over the next year, or certainly over the next 4 years, this is clearly, a key strategic region that's going to be really important. But I think in the next month or so, it may not be as, it may not come up quite as much. I may be wrong, but it may not come up quite as much as we expect. And we may not even have a very clear idea on exactly how all the communication strategies are going to be developed.
Thank you. On the communication bit, I want to emphasize how for the October agreement, for example, it would be so helpful if there was more transparency on both sides, and there isn't. And so I think there's a lot of guesswork into what is the content of what came out from the sidelines of the BRICS summit. But I want to also just emphasize what Prashanta said, but say the inverse is so true also, which is that in addition to how the U.S. decline narrative is moving in all parts of the world, but also this inability for those in power to pop the lid of those other large states and look what's happening underneath that seamless sort of exterior, which is the problem with how China is being looked at. There is really not enough understanding of China's own politics of scale problem. Its inability to really govern in a very functional way, and so that its domestic public is such a problem for them, and that we have to wonder about who is how the decision making is happening at that top level because of that problem. So I guess just having a clear-eyed understanding of that, it may be for expediency that the decisions are still going the same direction for many different larger reasons. But I think the narrative part is really important. It really shifts tendencies and trend lines, and there has been an unwillingness to pop that lid and look underneath what the state really represents.
Thanks so much for entertaining my question first, and let's go ahead and pass on to the audience as well as in person and online. So for questions, we have the table microphones in front. There should be a touch panel button on the lower right-hand side. You can tap that to activate your microphone. Please identify yourself, including your name and affiliation. Try to keep it to one question, and please address your question to a specific panelist or panelists. And go ahead and raise hands for any questions you might have. But since we're at a university setting, I would like to offer the first question to a student. If there's a student in the audience who has a very burning question, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. Former students also count as well. Great, please.
My question for Taiwan. Yesterday, nominated.
Sorry, could you identify yourself as well, please?
I'm a student, Asian study, graduate student, A school, GWU. My question about Taiwan. And yesterday, Rubio, the nominated Secretary of State Department, witness in Congress, he support deterrence strategy of Taiwan. But we know, as Professor Robert Starr said, Trump is a transaction politician. He always think Taiwan issue is Xi Jinping and Trump personal issue. And he asked Taiwan increase defense budget. So Trump's strategy is totally different to Rubio's strategy of Taiwan. So do you think in during second term, Trump's strategy will be conflict with Rubio, and Trump will make big deal with Xi Jinping to sell out Taiwan?
Annie, I'd like to toss that to you. So sounds like two-part. First one is Trump, Rubio, and maybe the broader question of these kinds of policy direction tensions within the administration. And then second one on first panel mentioned grand bargaining between Xi and Trump. So anything you want to take on?
Yeah, I think on grand bargaining, that's a question we get a lot. Let me just say, if I was President Trump, you know that the thing that is like your greatest point of leverage with Xi Jinping is Taiwan. You know that's a clear red line for the Chinese government. You know that that is something that Xi Jinping himself would like love to come to a deal on, right? Like this is a grand bargain. I do not see what Xi Jinping could offer Trump and the United States economy or the United States like political system that would be worth handing that chip over, because that is such a valuable chip. So I know that there's a lot of consternation about this, but I really don't see, you know, there being a deal where we just hand over Taiwan. That's just too big of, like, if you're looking at it purely from a leverage and like bilateral perspective, that's just a very big chip. In terms of Rubio, Senator Rubio's views versus President Trump's views, this is kind of what I was talking about before. You have the hardliners that are within the Trump administration that are going to have a voice. Unclear yet whether they're going to have the most dominant voice. I think depending on what President Trump decides on Taiwan, I don't think that there's like a Trump strategy on Taiwan. I don't think he himself has come to terms with what he wants his policy to be on Taiwan. So I think the decision-making factor is going to end up with what is happening on that exact day and at that exact moment, who's in the room making the best argument and the most impressive argument amongst his cabinet and his White House officials. And there's other opportunities, you know, or other factors that are going to play into that too. Like, how's the U.S. stock market doing that day? Where are they on like econ negotiations with China at the time? You know, what is there a very strong push and willingness to fight that has been demonstrated by the Taiwanese government, the Taiwanese military? All these like little factors that change every single day, I think are going to accumulate to a decision kind of on the spot for President Trump. I don't think he's coming in with a predisposed view of what he wants Taiwan's strategy to be.
Thank you. So opening the floor to other audience members for questions, please raise your hands. Oh, sorry. Yes, please.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
My name is Rockwell Clancy. I'm a research scientist at Virginia Tech. So it's to kind of follow up on that question. I think that's right on, that they don't have a policy, and that it's the Taiwan question is going to be left to the vicissitudes of like how Trump is feeling that day or people in the cabinet are feeling. And so what strategies do you think other people in the government might take to ensure that kind of Taiwan is taken care of? So an example of this would be playing up the fact that Taiwan is the center for chips production in the world. And, you know, China wouldn't dare because of that, or something like that along those lines. So to ensure that it's an issue and there's a kind of line. And then I guess kind of as a follow-up to that, I mean, I agree with you that Xi Jinping has increasingly fewer nonviolent options. And then his legitimacy is tied to what happens in Taiwan, such that China going to war with Taiwan becomes more and more likely. I'm not sure, though, that there's an appetite in the United States for the United States to go to war with China over that. And so I guess in the years leading up to it, what strategies do you think that other people might take, or what's the argument?
Yeah, the great points. When you say like strategies, do you mean if you're like on the outskirts of like trying to get President Trump to defend Taiwan, or do you mean to like manipulate, you know, try to get Xi Jinping to like Who's the target, I guess, yeah.
Good, all of the above.
All the above, okay.
And so, yeah, but all of the above. And especially since it's not just about the Trump administration, but there are all these other
Yeah.
parties involved.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Like the business community also.
yes, no, you're absolutely right. I think, again, the decision will be made on a bunch of factors, some of which I said in the previous answer. And I think you're absolutely right that public opinion is going to be one of those factors that plays into decision making. So if I was, you know, a lowly staffer who was trying to convince President Trump that he should, you know, put his weight behind defending Taiwan, and also trying to convince Xi Jinping somehow simultaneously that Taiwan is not actually that important, I think, you know, the ways that you would be like public narrative is like trying to get Americans to support the idea of defending Taiwan. It would be hardening our deterrence postures so that we have the capability if things were to pop off. It would be, you know, not only looking at the economic arguments for it, not just that, like everyone always focuses on Taiwan as a chip manufacturer, but I think it's more so that the waterways around Taiwan, if there is any disruption there, we are screwed, right? I mean, we saw how bad one random container in the Suez Canal really screwed up global shipping during the pandemic. And we see that there's a lot of shipping disruptions in the Red Sea right now. Imagine the Taiwan Strait, right? We use the Taiwan Strait to access 4 of our top 10 trading partners. There is no way that that is going to happen if there is any type of even blockade or conflict or contested waters around Taiwan. If that were the case, we would have to use all our shipping to go around Indonesia, which is a very rocky archipelago that adds weeks and weeks to even normal shipping times and can't manage the same amount of commercial merchant ships that the Taiwan, you know, the Taiwan Strait and then the east of Taiwan can manage. So I think there's, you know, those economic arguments to be made as well. And then of course it's the political arguments of credibility in the Indo-Pacific, but also like if President, you know, you can flatter his ego too. Like President Trump likes to be perceived as a strongman. What are ways that he can come across as a strongman? And the way to do that is to show him opportunities where the United States and Taiwan come out victorious. And that goes back to hardening our defense posture and making sure we have the capability to do what we say.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from the audience members online. We have a question here. The panelists talk about the U.S. government providing a value proposition separate from private businesses to Southeast Asian countries to draw them away from China's orbit. Maybe that's referring to Prashant's earlier comments. But to me, the best way for the U.S. to achieve this is by rejoining the CPTPP. Do you think there will be political will in the future for the U.S. to do so? So specifically on CPTPP, is there any interest or will to rejoin that, and maybe broadening it out, I guess, U.S. appetite for joining or creating new multilats, mini-lats, or bilateral economic strategies? So open to the floor, any comments on economic frameworks?
Well, I'll start briefly. I mean, I think I think one would hope that that was the case, that the Trump administration would rejoin CPTPP, only because I think sometimes now free trade is kind of perceived, I think wrongly in my view, as being some sort of concession that we're giving countries. Free trade, you know, it's for U.S. interests. It promotes specialization. It's a way that we, the United States, are part of the most prosperous region in the world. That's already going to be over 50% of world GDP. If we don't do that, then what happens is one scenario, which is happening now. If you look at the supply chains, Peterson Institute of International Economics came out with a survey last year and said that for all the talk about Indo-Pacific diversification of supply chains, what we're seeing slowly is that supply chains are increasingly being concentrated around China. Not because everyone loves China, but because China is party to a lot of these agreements. And by natural sort of force of center of gravity, if the United States is not doing something to pull these countries away in another direction, they're going to concentrate around the Indo-Pacific because of virtue of geography. And so one would hope, I mean, when the TPP was initially sort of propagated, you know, I recall very distinctly, this was after the period where the Bush administration had tried bilateral agreements. And then we said, oh, okay, these are not really working. Maybe we can have a minilateral setting so that we can get these countries. And now we're saying we're back to bilateral agreements. But we're negotiating on trade deficits, and we're saying we're not really providing market access. So these countries are asking, well, what's the value proposition? What are you offering us that we can't get otherwise? And so I guess
absent the US joining CPTPP, the broader question is really, how does the United States ensure that it's engaged in the most prosperous and most geopolitically and geoeconomically strategic region in the world? And that's for US interests. And if it's not the CPTPP, my question is, what is it? So we had the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that went nowhere. We said we're out of CPTPP. We tried bilats, we're not doing that. We tried to negotiate bilateral deals, no countries wanted to sign up. So what are we really doing here? And a lot of it is kind of, we're working with our allies and partners, but frankly, when I travel to Southeast Asia, all I hear from governments is, look, we know what your allies are doing. The Japanese are doing even more than the Chinese, and they get a lot less credit. We know what the Australians are doing, and they struggle and they have their own problems, the changes of government, but we want to know what you're doing specifically. And I think that economic value proposition is absolute. I think the Biden administration deserves some credit, to be honest, for trying to sort of talk about agreements on critical minerals, for example, semiconductors. That's very small stuff, but at least there was a positive value proposition. So the question for me under the Trump administration is, you can have all kinds of punitive things and talk about burden sharing and all that good stuff, but what are you going to put on the table with respect to incentives to get the countries to do what you want them to do, right? And I think that's absent in my view. So CPTPP, I wish it were the case, but actually I would settle for just anything on the basis of any incentive on US policy to promote these countries to do what we're asking them to do.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up IPEF, right? IPEF was a non-binding, non-market access including set of principles. Like it's literally called a framework, not even an agreement. And the trade pillar fell out of it and it died because of domestic opposition here in the United States. There was senators that wrote a joint letter talking about the trade pillar and it died because of that. So I think the appetite for multilateral trade agreements is pretty much dead. But I do think that there is an opening for bilateral trade agreements and for, as Prashant rightly pointed out, some of these sectoral agreements like around critical minerals. I think we do, USMCA does not have the best reputation now because of everything that has been pointed out about certain loopholes that the PRC has had for manufacturing in Mexico, and that has really spurred a relook at that agreement. But we do tend to forget that under the Trump administration, they did negotiate USMCA successfully, right? And that was a binding trade agreement. And they also were pretty good at negotiating the free trade agreement with Korea, South Korea as well. So there was an opportunity for bilateral and these like mini-lateral trade agreements under the first Trump administration, largely because of Mnuchin and Lighthizer. But I think there might be an opportunity for some of these like direct bilateral trade agreements or for these mini sectoral agreements under the next administration too, because a lot of the opposition with IPEF, my understanding is that was kind of coming from within the Democratic Party too. And there just wasn't enough political capital behind the framework to kind of expend everything on this non-binding agreement.
Yeah, I think everything that's been said is correct in the sense, especially the U.S. pointing out that the Trump administration actually did more trade agreements than the Biden administration. So there is potential there. I will say, I think I think the sectoral agreements have been challenging. I think many countries have really put a lot of hope in these sectoral agreements. I mean, the European Union has also been trying to do its own sectoral agreements. It's not clear that they really have achieved much. So far, but perhaps there can be better examples moving forward. So I think the idea is certainly very attractive and politically I think a little more palatable in a moment in which trade is not particularly attractive. But I think all this actually highlights a bigger problem where we're moving into a world of sort of economic security, geopolitics, geoeconomics, right? Where it makes sense. You want to reshape value chains so that you're more integrated with your friends and you're less integrated with your rivals. All these things that would make a lot of sense from that perspective don't necessarily make a lot of sense from your sort of domestic political economy, right? And so you have these challenges where, despite all the incentive, geopolitical or political diplomacy incentives to become more integrated with partners in the Indo-Pacific or with the European Union, the United States has completely failed to achieve those kinds of agreements over the past few years because there is too much opposition when you start looking at the actual like interests in the political economy. You start looking at agriculture and everything collapses, right? And so I think that those structures are going to continue to be a bit of a challenge. So we're moving into a world where everybody's talking about economic security and prioritizing geopolitics, geoeconomics, etc. But we're still in the old world where actually value chains are determined by businesses and where things make sense economically, and also we have all these interest groups in our societies that actually shape a lot of our political economy decisions, trade decisions, and economic policymaking. So.
Just one point. I think all of what we've said is, from a Washington perspective, I generally agree with it. I would just say also important to recognize that even if we have constraints here, the region is not standing still, right? A lot of these countries, I mean, Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, these countries that think a lot about trade, they've signed a digital economy framework agreement, which is a sectoral agreement. There are green economy agreements that have come out. I think there was just one that was propagated on the sidelines of APAC a few months ago. There's green shipping corridors that are coming out. It's a really dynamic region. We're just unfortunately not plugged into it. But that doesn't mean that the innovation is not happening. And I think what you see sometimes in US policy is sometimes the action comes from the region, and then the US subsequently has to react to that. So I don't necessarily think that we're going to be stuck. I mean, maybe I'm being too optimistic. I don't necessarily think we're going to be stuck here forever. I do think there's a dynamic where even if the United States is not as engaged, there will be other actors that are involved. Japan is involved, Australia, a few other countries, India not so much, unfortunately. But there may be a dynamic where there's a resetting gradually, in spite of what the United States.
Yeah, and just that was the point I was trying to make in my initial remarks, where I think in the global governance sphere, we might actually see some really interesting developments, even though, the US pulls back in some areas. We'll probably see actually China being more of a leader, but in others there may be other countries, and it may be countries with which the US has longstanding ties, and even if those ties maybe are not going to be as strong in coming years, they might get stronger again in the future. So I think those are just, I agree that this is going to be interesting to watch.
Great. So we're actually just right at time. So I want to first, please join me in thanking our panelists for delivering great remarks. And this concludes our conference on this very important question on grand strategy and emerging challenges in the Indo-Pacific. I want to invite everyone to continue attending events held by all the co-sponsors, including the Institute for Korean Studies, the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, the Taiwan Education and Research Program, the East Asia National Resource Center, as well as our friends at Seoul National University and Ritsumeikan University. And we hope to see you very soon at more of our public policy events. Thank you very much and have a nice day, everyone.
So how do you feel about some sort of on from overblown, or you think?
Oh, yes, I can take that. No
It's
problem.
overblown, but I think you pointed out like Chinese military is not so hot right now. Which is like it's not a contingency, it's not because we're doing a good job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, David. Oh, did you take one in the?
I took it a lot better, but I don't think we have three photos. Everybody was like talking.
Sure.
Now we can do it for photos.